The trend of remakes and reboots is something we've grown exhaustively used to over the years, and the 2003 remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a huge reason that the remake boom of the 2000s kicked off in full force. Michael Bay's production company Platinum Dunes was pumping these things out like crazy, all on the heels of this Texas Chainsaw remake that showed them the box office potential in revisiting established horror IPs and updating them. Written by Scott Kozer and directed by Marcus Nispel, the remake of Texas Chainsaw Massacre may get a lot of blame for the trend kicking off the way it did, but it's also regarded as one of the more successful attempts at the formula. Good evening. My name's Evan and welcome to Rocklin Graves. First of all, yeah, this is a copy of the original movie. I don't own the remake on Blu-ray, which I probably should pick it up. I have two releases of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I'm going to save my really fancy one for when I do a video about that movie. But this is just a placeholder, and it's a really cool, look, it's a really cool steelbook. I like it, so I wanted to put it back there. Later this year, the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre will be celebrating its 50th birthday. It's a landmark film for horror that seems to get somewhat overlooked when compared to Halloween or A Nightmare on Elm Street, but it's aged like a fine wine and remains one of my favorite movies. I am planning on making a video about it for the anniversary, but I wanted to cover some more of the franchise beforehand, and I didn't want to start with the second movie since that would feel weird, so I decided to take a look at the 2003 remake to start off on a clean-ish slate. I'm sure it would have happened one way or another, but a lot of the revisitation of older horror movies can be traced back to this particular remake, and while a lot of these remakes were received very poorly, Marcus Nispel's Texas Chainsaw Massacre has a bit of a better reputation than some of the others. For a lot of people, this is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It was a jumping off point for a generation of people getting into horror, and it's usually talked about more fondly than something like Nightmare on Elm Street 2010 remake, which was also a Platinum Dunes production. With the original being one of my all-time favorite horror movies, and this remake being something I saw very early on in my horror journey, I'm excited to chat about this one. Before that though, I want to thank my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members. These videos take a lot of time and energy to make, and the extra support really helps to keep things moving. If you're interested in getting some bonus material and accessing private supporter-only polls or getting early access to the big videos, consider supporting me on either platform.
Get that nasty goddamn thing out of the back seat of my goddamn car. Put it in the trunk. What the hell's the matter with you?
One thing that I'll say right off the bat is that this movie seems to understand that there are certain elements of that original that simply can't be recreated. So instead of making an attempt at that, they do something different with it that retains some of the core ideas. Bringing back John Larroquette to do an opening narration is a really great way to give the movie a sense of authenticity that a lot of remakes are missing. And instead of doing the scrolling text on black background like they did in the original, we get some grainy footage of the investigation that follows the massacre. It does feel like a bit of a missed opportunity to me that they just word for word did the exact same narration that's in the first, because this is a fairly different movie in terms of approach, and I think if you're getting John Larroquette back, you might as well update this, right? Another such change is the hitchhiker, who was played by Edwin Neal in the original movie, and his performance resulted in an iconic scene that feels so uneasy and sickening, and I am deeply grateful that they didn't try and cast someone else to do an updated version of that scene. There's so much about the original that was just lightning in a bottle, and that scene was one of them, but instead of completely throwing the hitchhiker subplot away, they do something new with it. Our new cast of young hooligans driving through Texas aren't going to spend the weekend in an abandoned family-owned home. They're instead on their way to a Lynyrd Skynyrd concert after a quick stop in Mexico to buy a piñata. Also, I don't know if I'm actually pronouncing Lynyrd Skynyrd correctly. I know that there's a Lynyrd Skynyrd. It could be that for all I know. I don't care. I'm pronouncing it phonetically. Moving on. There's a bit of an awkward vibe to this group because they feel more like people in 2003 who really wish it was still the 70s than they do people who are actually living in the 70s. And considering how remote the spot they're traveling through is, I don't think it would have hurt the movie too much to just have it take place in 2003, especially since it's not like they were going for a 70s style of filmmaking. It's not a huge issue or anything, but it feels a bit like the movie's setting is battling with itself. Swapping things around and having the group pick up an escaped victim rather than one of the family members is a good way to approach this, and after a while of extremely vague answers to questions that really would save your life if you were a little more detailed, she pulls a gun from a fleshy holster, I suppose, and then puts a bit of a damper on this road trip. I think YouTube might spank me if I show you what she does, but I think I should at least be safe showing you this incredibly cool shot of the camera slowly backing away from their reactions and going through the freshly made gore tunnel that would make for a really great Doom level. Along with getting John Larroquette back for the narrations, another returning hand is Daniel Pearl, the cinematographer from the original movie. Well, it's really cool that he returned to the remake, and you can definitely see him paying some homage to his work from the original. The overall look of this one is missing that sort of fairy tale feel that came before. I mentioned the grainy footage from the opening scene and the opening narration, and while I really like that they put in that effort, I will say that it doesn't quite feel as fitting in this movie overall. The opening and closing scenes of the remake show some of that documentary style footage, but the remake is largely missing that really immersive documentary feel, which is a huge reason that the original is so disturbing. It feels less like you're watching a movie and more like you're having a nightmare, and that realism isn't present in the remake, which makes the documentary elements at the beginning and end feel a little tacked on. This one's presented much more as a movie than it is the fever dream of the original, and while the narration from Larroquette and the tone of those beginning and end scenes adds a sense of authenticity to the intentions behind the remake, they sort of feel inauthentic when taken in context because the movie isn't approached in that way. I don't actually mind that they went for a different tone here, but it does make those scenes feel a little out of place. One thing that this movie does very, very well is making you feel just really gross. Everything's slimy, sweaty, and dirty. Hell, even the color grading on the movie could make you feel nauseous if you're not already having a great day. It's not even something that's introduced once the gnarly shit starts happening. Every single person in this movie looks like they're one pothole away from vomiting from the start.
Oh no, thank you, I'm nauseous.
That might actually be unrelated. Apparently there was a plot line in the script where Erin was pregnant with Kemper's baby, but they didn't wind up going through with it. Our main cast of young would-be briskets are genuinely one of the movie's strongest elements, which isn't always the case when it comes to this kind of thing. There's the standard back and forth shit chatting, but after the whole thing goes down with the hitchhiker and they're left with a backseat messier than a family road trip with young children, there's a genuinely great section of the movie where they're trying to figure out what the hell they're meant to do. The initial reactions from everyone really sell the whole thing, and I love how that great shot sucks you into the surreality of the moment. I appreciate that they don't just gloss over this situation to try and rush as fast as humanly possible to the Texas Chainsaw stuff, and instead we sit with them for quite a while as they weigh their options and some ethical questions are raised and fought over within the group.
How would you like it if we just dumped your body out here?
I'm sorry, nobody asked her to blow her head off in our van.
It's honestly my favorite section of the movie, just following along with the group as they go from the initial shock and frozen panic of witnessing something like this to trying to find somewhere with a phone they can use. There's a really believable sense of unreality from the bluntness of something like this, and I appreciate how they all seem to be trying to wrap their heads around it in their own unique ways.
I guess that's what brains look like. Sort of like, lasagna.
The stress of the whole thing just feels very tangible, and there's this great ever-growing sense that they're not going to find much help with every stop they make. They're very much out of their element here and are not getting far past being seen as outsiders, but of course there's also more going on here than they know at first. I think the only spot where this sequence struggles a little bit is that I don't quite buy the group dynamic. There isn't quite enough here to make this feel like a group of people who've known each other for a while. That doesn't apply to Pepper, of course, since they actually did meet yesterday, but it sort of feels like they all met in Mexico and decided to meet up for this concert. Some of that is, again, because the era that this movie is set in requires that they interact differently, and the movie's writing isn't quite strong enough to make that feel natural, so a lot of their earlier interactions feel forced and kind of wooden, which in turn creates this feeling that these aren't characters that are super comfortable around one another. There is one moment where all of what I said can be completely disregarded, and that's when they're stopped at a mill and go running inside after they hear a sound. They open a door to find a cute little possum that startles the group, and there's this great moment where they all start laughing together, breaking up the tension in this horrible situation and gluing them together more as a unit.
Give me something to hold. It's a possum.
This feels like a group of friends, and it's the sort of thing I wanted to see more of earlier on. Also, apparently they had to shoot this scene multiple times because the possum was too cute to actually be scary, and I love that. Now, of course, this isn't a movie about a bunch of Lynyrd Skynyrd fans trying to deal with a dead body. That's just the vehicle that the movie uses to get them involved with some unsavory individuals, and oh, how the individuals in this movie do so lack savor. I cannot reiterate enough how I appreciate that this movie clearly understands that it purely cannot recreate recreate a lot of what made the original so good, and the Hewitt family is yet another example of this. We've of course got Leatherface, who's been renamed to Thomas Hewitt now instead of Bubba Sawyer, but then there's Sheriff Hoyt, played by the always intimidating Arlie Ermy, Luda May, Henrietta, Monty, and then this lovely lady who's only credited as Tea Lady. Feels like certain elements of the personalities of the family members from the first movie were split up and manifested in their own characters, so while the family dynamic is extremely different and they don't feel as unhinged in the same way, the spirit of that is still here in some capacity. I think because there are quite a few more this time around, none of them stick out in the same way except for Sheriff Hoyt, and that's both because Arlie Ermy is just iconic and also because he's such a sick, unrelenting villain that is uncomfortable to be around in basically every single moment. He first shows up to transport the girl's body out of the group's car, and right away, he's just the most disgusting, horrific dude who I just couldn't help but physically cringe from at times.
Oh, look at that. It's kind of wet down there. What have you boys been doing with this dead body anyway?
He's just straight up tormenting them while he's doing it, basically waging psychological warfare on these youngsters who he knows he's going to put through even more hell later on. Right away, he establishes a very volatile dominance with such a crazy amount of tension because he seems so unpredictable, and it feels like every single move or thing said by someone else in his presence is something he'll twist and use against them. Like, no matter what they do here, he's gonna weaponize it. He's got the most to do out of all the family, and while I don't think it's to the point where the rest of them blend together, they're just not anywhere near as memorable as Sheriff Hoyt is, and especially not memorable compared to the family from the original movie. One thing that I really like about the family is how they kind of create this bubble of control over every spot the group tries to go to. That's still the case in the original movie, of course, but since the only authority figure we meet is also involved, it feels like they're sort of lording over this entire area, while the family in the first movie felt more like they were isolated and trying to avoid the public. It's a bit more of an oppressive approach to the family in the remake, and it works pretty well. It creates a very strong feeling that no matter who the group finds or calls, they're also probably going to be involved in some way. One of the great things that comes from that is that this forces the characters into more of an offensive position than they were in the original, where the primary goal was just to escape. Here, we get some scenes of the group fighting back against the family, which gives them a bit more agency in the story as opposed to them all getting killed off without really having much of a chance to put up a fight. This is especially true for Aaron once we get to the third act, but I'll talk about that in a bit. There's another family member who I didn't mention, that being Jedediah, a young child who winds up helping out our group and doesn't fit in with the rest of his family. He's an interesting addition in concept, but he doesn't really change much, and I don't feel like he has enough development to make his archetype feel as impactful as it could have. He distracts Leatherface at the end to give Aaron and Morgan a chance to run away, but that's really the only moment he's got. There really is a lot to like with this remake, especially when it's compared with a lot of other attempts at this formula. However, I have to be honest and say that while I can appreciate things about this movie, I'm really not a huge fan of the overall package, and that's for a few reasons. The biggest one being that the identity of the original movie has so much to do with that sense of immersion and dreamy realism that makes it feel so unbelievably disturbing, while the remake feels very movie-ish. A lot of things that make the Texas Chainsaw Massacre a unique movie, even with everything that's come in the decades since, seems to have been left behind and replaced with more generic or less interesting versions of their former selves, which, well, I'm glad they didn't try and recreate that movie and fail at it. It feels like the new approach kind of results in this movie blending in with too many other slashers. Honestly, the biggest mistake that this franchise has continued to make over and over again is how Leatherface is handled, and while there have absolutely been worse incarnations of the character in other entries, this movie still makes the mistake of trying to turn him into a hulking and brutal killer as opposed to the scared child he was in the first. Now, at least here, there's still a family that's bossing him around, but when he's on his own, he doesn't have that vibe of being afraid of the people he's killing, which is something that made him so frightening and unique before. It's a problem throughout the franchise, to be fair, but it doesn't change that the biggest thing that distinguishes Leatherface from so many other killers in horror movies is mostly absent. He's big and intimidating in this movie, without a doubt, and I think the actual design of his character is fantastic here, but I don't find him anywhere near as frightening as I do in the original movie because there are so many killers portrayed this way. They also made a change to have him be suffering from a degenerative skin condition for some reason that doesn't really add much, at least not to me. I guess that's the angle they're trying to take and to try and make him more sympathetic, but I mean, it doesn't work. I'm also not a fan of seeing his face like this, since a huge part of Leatherface's character is that he doesn't really have a personality of his own. He wears a few different masks in the original, each reflecting a personality appropriate for what it is he's doing at any given moment. In the remake, it seems like he wears other people's faces because he's jealous of them having ones that aren't rotting away. And look, I don't want to be that guy and pick apart the logic of someone so messed up, but it sort of bothers me because if you want a face that isn't withering away, wouldn't he be better off figuring out some sort of non-organic face covering? I don't know, this just doesn't work as well in my opinion. There are a few really great moments, like when Kemper gets attacked in the house and then Leatherface is seen wearing his fresh face later on. I also really like the chase scene with Andy through the drying laundry outside, who definitely has the roughest go out of anyone in the group. He's the only one lucky enough to receive the iconic meat hook treatment, and well, it doesn't hit quite as hard since this movie just doesn't feel as believable to me, and I don't think the reaction is as visceral. There's no way to get around saying that this is really damn hard to watch. It's cringeworthy to watch him try and pull off the hook and fall back down on it, and he ultimately gives up when Aaron finds him later on and asks her to take him out. Which, by the way, fuck you, Aaron. If someone asks you to kill them and you oblige, don't stab them in the fucking stomach. Do something that'll make it quicker. This is just rude. I do also think that the movie runs into some pretty rough pacing issues around the time that Aaron stumbles into the trailer with Henrietta and the tea lady chilling out. At least to me, it's pretty clear right away that they're gonna have something to do with what's going on, and this isn't actually any sort of safe haven, and I find it really hard to take either of them seriously, so it doesn't have any of the creep factor that I'd like to see from a scene like this. It feels a lot more awkward than it does creepy, which is honestly something that I felt throughout a lot of this movie. I think where the bulk of my issues come from is that while the first act is actually pretty damn good, the stuff that comes after just doesn't feel as unique or interesting and kind of feels like a more generic version of the original. The set design is really great without question, but as far as scare factor or atmosphere, it just doesn't quite land the way it seems to for a lot of people. It's great that Daniel Pearl returned as cinematographer, but aside from the shots paying homage to his work from the original, the cinematography is nothing all that special, and what really kills the vibe of this movie for me is the score. Platinum Dunes had a really bad track record with the music in their horror remakes, and this is no exception. It feels so wrong to have the score in a gritty Texas Chainsaw movie just be generic horror music that feels like the sort of thing you can find in the YouTube audio library, but I've honestly found better music there. I do appreciate though that Erin is much more of a fighter than Sally was, which does add some flair that I felt was largely missing in a lot of this movie. Hell, she even leaves Leatherface one arm poorer by the end, and she's just a really badass final girl. There's also a really great emotional gut punch added in where an engagement ring is found with Kemper, but Aaron never finds out about this. That's a really great moment, especially since this was set up at the beginning of the movie.
It's your cut diamond ring that goes right here on my beautiful little finger.
We're gonna get you a ring someday.
That's the sort of thing that I feel like lifts this remake above a lot of the others that were coming out at the time, and even though I'm honestly not that into the movie as a whole, I can definitely appreciate that they put more effort into this than some of the movies that followed. Aaron manages to save a baby that was kidnapped from the hitchhiker we saw earlier on and drives off after hot-wiring Hewitt's patrol car, who tries to stop her from getting away but gets flattened out like dough, which I think is a really fitting end for this guy. The movie closes off on another tacked-on documentary scene that shows two officers getting killed after the scene was not properly secured, and then we get a genuinely great image of Leatherface that makes me really wish that the whole movie leaned more into this gritty realism. The 2003 remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is an okay remake and a pretty good slasher, but when looked at in full, it feels lackluster. It's not unwatchable or anything, I just feel like it tried spreading itself out too much with all these different family members and a portrayal of Leatherface that feels less unique than before, and it's all spread quite thin. The first act is actually great, and the set designs are really good, although not nearly as immersive as what came in the original. Arlie Ermey is so good as Sheriff Hewitt, and the design of Leatherface is awesome, but I honestly find that this movie's just kind of boring. I don't find this incarnation of the family nearly as interesting. The music is insanely bland and generic. The pacing starts to seriously drag in the middle, and while this movie definitely has a distinct tone, the less surrealistic approach just doesn't work for me. I'm not a big fan of it, but there are things that it does really well, and it's got a huge fan base, and for good reason. Like, I can see what it is that people love so much about this movie, and it is distinct from the original, which is great. It just doesn't work for me. Next up, we'll be taking a look at The Strangers, Prey at Night, the only sequel that was ever released to The Strangers before this upcoming trilogy from Rennie Harlin. Until then, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.